June 22, 1941. Lieutenant Hans Becker stood in the cupola of his Panzer III near the Lithuanian border, surveying the road ahead through early morning mist. At 24, he'd already fought in Poland and France, his tank crew veterans of campaigns so swift they seemed almost effortless. Behind him stretched an endless column of German armour, 3,000 tanks rolling east as part of Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union. The Wehrmacht had crushed every army it had faced. The panzers were invincible, cutting through enemy formations like a knife through paper. Becker believed this completely. Every German tanker did. In 48 hours, that belief would be shattered by a machine unlike anything the German army had encountered. A Soviet tank that defied every rule of armoured warfare the Germans thought they'd mastered. What German soldiers said when they first faced the T-34 would reveal a truth the Wehrmacht High Command didn't want to hear. Germany had underestimated the Soviets catastrophically, and the panzers that had conquered Europe were suddenly terrifyingly obsolete. The invasion began at 3:15 a.m. with a rolling artillery barrage that lit the sky from the Baltic to the Black Sea. German forces surged forward along a 1,800-mile front, the largest military operation in history. 3.5 million men, 3,600 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, 2,700 aircraft, all committed to destroying the Soviet Union in a campaign Hitler predicted would last 8 weeks, maybe 10. For the first days, everything went according to plan. Soviet border units collapsed under the onslaught. German panzers raced forward, encircling entire Soviet armies before they could retreat or organize resistance. Hans Becker's company advanced 60 miles in 2 days, encountering only light resistance. The Soviet tanks they did face, antiquated T-26s and BT-7s, were destroyed with ease. Becker's 50mm gun punched through their thin armour from 800 metres. The Russian crews abandoned their vehicles and fled. Some tanks didn't even have ammunition. "They're primitives," Becker's gunner, Corporal Ernst Müller, said on the second day, watching another Soviet tank burn after a single shot. "This will be easier than France." The German intelligence reports supported this confidence. Soviet tanks were known quantities, poorly armoured, undergunned, crewed by untrained peasants. The Red Army had been gutted by Stalin's purges in the late 1930s. Experienced officers had been executed, replaced by political appointees with no tactical knowledge. German commanders expected Soviet resistance to crumble within weeks, the entire campaign to be wrapped up before autumn. What they didn't know was that in factories across the Soviet Union, a new weapon had been in production since 1940. A tank that Soviet engineers had designed to specifications that seemed impossible. Armour thick enough to resist German anti-tank guns, a gun powerful enough to destroy any German tank, sloped armour that deflected shells rather than absorbing them, and speed that matched or exceeded German panzers. It was called the T-34, and by June 1941, over 1,200 had been built and distributed to Soviet armoured units. The Wehrmacht knew nothing about it. German intelligence had failed completely. No agent had reported on the T-34's development or deployment. The few reconnaissance reports mentioning a new Soviet tank had been dismissed as exaggeration or propaganda. How could the Soviets, with their backward industry and decimated officer corps, have produced anything that could challenge German engineering superiority? It was unthinkable. June 24th, near Rethinking in Lithuania. Becker's company was advancing through wooded terrain when the lead tank in the column suddenly exploded, its turret blown completely off. The crew didn't have time to bail out. They were killed instantly. Becker's radio crackled with confused reports. Enemy tank, location unknown. The forest provided cover, and smoke from the burning Panzer III obscured visibility. Becker ordered his driver to reverse behind a farmhouse. seeking cover while his crew tried to locate the threat. Then they saw it. A Soviet tank emerged from the tree line 400 meters away, and Becker felt his stomach drop. It was massive, its turret angled in a way German tanks weren't, its hull sloped sharply instead of vertical. Even from a distance, he could see that the armor was thick, far thicker than the Soviet tanks they'd been destroying for 2 days. "Fire!" Becker shouted. Muller aimed carefully and squeezed the trigger. The 50mm gun barked, the shells striking the Soviet tank's front armor. Becker expected to see the tank stop, smoke, brew up. Instead, the shells sparked off the sloped armor and ricocheted harmlessly into the sky. The Soviet tank didn't even slow down. It rotated its turret toward them with mechanical precision. "Hit it again!" Becker yelled, his voice rising. Muller fired twice more. Both shells bounced off. The Soviet tank's gun fired once, a deep boom that was louder than any tank gun Becker had heard. The shell missed Becker's Panzer III by inches, striking the farmhouse behind them and demolishing the entire structure in a shower of brick and timber. "Reverse! Reverse now!" Becker screamed into the intercom. His driver threw the tank into reverse, the engine screaming as they backed away desperately. The Soviet tank fired again. This time, the shell hit another German tank in Becker's platoon, penetrating the frontal armor and igniting the ammunition. The explosion was catastrophic. No one survived. Becker's company retreated, leaving 3 burning panzers behind. It was the first time in the war that German armor had been forced to withdraw from a single enemy tank. The tank crews were shaken, confused, angry. What was that thing? Why couldn't their guns penetrate it? Were all Soviet tanks like this? The reports came flooding into German armoured divisions along the entire front. Near Grodno, a German panzer battalion encountered 6 T-34s and lost 20 tanks trying to destroy them. The German crews reported that their standard anti-tank shells simply bounced off the Soviet tank's armour. Direct hits at close range had no effect. The T-34s, meanwhile, destroyed German panzers with single shots from ranges that German tanks couldn't match. At Dubno, a Lieutenant Klaus von Strachwitz watched in horror as T-34s drove straight through his defensive position, crushing German anti-tank guns under their tracks. His 37mm anti-tank guns fired repeatedly at point-blank range. The shells ricocheted harmlessly off the T-34's armour. The Soviet tanks didn't even stop. They rolled over the gun positions, crushing weapons and crews alike, then continued through the German lines as if nothing had happened. "It's like shooting at a fortress," von Strachwitz reported to his battalion commander. "Our guns are useless. We might as well be throwing stones." German tank crews began calling the T-34 Der russische Panzer, the Russian tank, as if it were the only Soviet tank that mattered, which in a way it was. Veteran panzer commanders who'd fought confidently in Poland and France now refused to engage T-34s unless they had overwhelming numerical superiority or could maneuver for flank shots. The psychological impact was devastating. German soldiers had been told they were fighting an inferior enemy with inferior equipment. The propaganda had been absolute. Soviet tanks were trash. Soviet soldiers were subhuman. German superiority was unquestionable. Now, German tankers were being slaughtered by a Soviet tank that was superior to anything Germany fielded. It violated the Nazi worldview at the most fundamental level. General Heinz Guderian, one of Germany's most celebrated panzer commanders, encountered T-34s on June 26th near Minsk. His division lost 12 tanks in an engagement that should have been routine. Guderian was shocked. He immediately sent a report to Wehrmacht High Command describing the T-34's capabilities and recommending urgent countermeasures. The T-34 possesses armour that our 50mm guns cannot penetrate frontally, Guderian wrote. Its 76mm gun can destroy any German tank at ranges beyond our effective engagement distance. Its speed and manoeuvrability exceed our Panzer IIIs and IVs. We are facing a technical crisis that must be addressed immediately. The report landed on desks in Berlin like a bombshell. Senior officers who read it were incredulous. The Soviets couldn't have built such a tank. It was impossible. German intelligence would have known. Guderian must be exaggerating, or his crews had panicked and misidentified what they faced. But more reports arrived daily. Every panzer division that encountered T-34s sent similar assessments. The descriptions were consistent: impenetrable frontal armor, devastating firepower, exceptional speed, sloped armor that deflected shells. Some reports included measurements taken from destroyed T-34. The frontal armor was 45 mm thick, but sloped at 60 degrees, giving it effective protection equivalent to 90 mm of vertical armor. German Panzer IIIs had 30 mm of vertical frontal armor. The T-34 was 3 times more protected. The gun was equally shocking. The T-34's 76 mm gun fired a shell with more than twice the kinetic energy of German 50 mm guns. It could penetrate 69 mm of armor at 500 meters. German Panzer IIIs had 50 mm of frontal armor at most. The T-34 could destroy them from any angle at any practical combat range. And the design philosophy was entirely different from German tanks. German engineers prioritized precision engineering, complex transmissions, high-quality optics. The T-34 was simpler, cruder even, but devastatingly effective. Its wide tracks distributed weight efficiently, allowing it to cross terrain that German tanks bogged down in. Its diesel engine was more reliable and less likely to catch fire than German gasoline engines. Its sloped armor was a revolutionary concept that German tank designers hadn't fully embraced. The T-34 is the best tank in the world, General Ewald von Kleist would later tell his superiors. Von Kleist commanded the 1st Panzer Group and had more experience fighting Soviet armor than almost any German officer. His assessment was unambiguous. Germany's tanks were inferior. The Wehrmacht was fighting with obsolete equipment against a superior enemy. German tank crews developed desperate tactics to cope. They avoided frontal engagements with T-34s at all costs. Instead, they tried to maneuver for flank shots where the T-34's side armor was thinner. They coordinated attacks with multiple tanks, hoping to distract the T-34 while one panzer got a side shot. They called in air support, using Stuka dive bombers to attack T-34s from above where the top armor was thinnest. None of these solutions were satisfactory. They required numerical superiority, air superiority, and favorable terrain. When German tanks met T-34s in equal numbers on open ground, the Germans lost. Lieutenant Hans Becker survived his first encounter with a T-34, but 2 weeks later, near Smolensk, his luck ran out. His company encountered 3 T-34s in a wheat field. Becker tried to flank them, using the tall wheat for concealment. His driver maneuvered expertly, keeping the engine noise low. They got within 200 meters of one T-34, close enough for a side shot that might penetrate. Müller fired. The shell struck the T-34's side armor and penetrated, a small victory. The Soviet tank stopped, smoke pouring from its engine compartment. But the other 2 T-34s had spotted Becker's position. They converged on him from different angles, their 76mm guns traversing smoothly. Becker's final radio transmission was brief. "They're too fast. We can't..." The T-34's shell hit Becker's Panzer III in the frontal armor, penetrating completely. The tank erupted in flames. Becker and his crew died instantly. They were among thousands of German tankers killed by T-34s in the summer of 1941. German industry scrambled to respond. In July 1941, a delegation of German tank designers and military officials examined captured T-34s at a proving ground near Berlin. They measured every dimension, tested the armor, studied the gun, analyzed the suspension. Their conclusion was unanimous. The T-34 was superior to any German tank in production or development. Germany needed to respond urgently. The response took 2 forms: First, existing Panzer IVs were upgunned with longer 75mm guns that could penetrate T-34 armour at moderate ranges. This was a stopgap measure, improving German capabilities but not achieving parity with the T-34. Second, Germany began developing entirely new tanks designed specifically to counter the T-34, the Panther and the Tiger. These programs were accelerated drastically. The Panther, in particular, was heavily influenced by the T-34's design, incorporating sloped armour and a high-velocity gun. German engineers essentially admitted that the Soviet design was superior and copied its key features. But these new tanks wouldn't be ready until 1942 or 1943. In the meantime, German panzer divisions had to fight with inferior equipment against an enemy tank that could destroy them with ease. The T-34's impact extended beyond the battlefield. It shattered German confidence in their technological superiority. It forced a complete re-evaluation of German tank design philosophy. It proved that the Soviets were capable of industrial and engineering achievements that German racial ideology said were impossible. "If I had known they had tanks like this," Hitler reportedly said, after reading reports about the T-34, "I would have thought twice about invading." It was too late for second thoughts. By July 1941, Germany was committed to a campaign that would consume 80% of its military resources for the next 4 years. And throughout that campaign, the T-34 remained a constant threat, a reminder that German victory was not inevitable, that Soviet ingenuity could match or exceed German engineering. Soviet production numbers told the story of the T-34's importance. By the end of 1941, despite losing huge amounts of territory and industrial capacity to the German invasion, the Soviet Union produced over 3,000 T-34s. By the end of the war, total T-34 production exceeded 84,000 tanks. It became the most produced tank in history, and many historians argue it was the best tank of World War II when considering the combination of firepower, protection, mobility, and ease of production. German soldiers' reactions to the T-34 evolved from shock to respect to something approaching fear. Veteran panzer crews who'd fought confidently across Europe now approached every engagement with caution. Knowing that a T-34 could be waiting around any corner, its sloped armour impervious to their guns, its 76mm cannon capable of destroying their tank with a single shot. "We thought we were invincible," a German tank commander, Erwin Bauer, wrote in his diary in August 1941. "We'd beaten everyone, Poland, France, the British at Dunkirk. We thought the Russians would be easy. Then we met the T-34, and we realised we'd been fighting second-rate opponents. The Russians were different. Their tank was better than ours. We were the ones who were outclassed." This realisation didn't come easily to German soldiers raised on Nazi propaganda about Aryan superiority and Slavic inferiority. It challenged their entire worldview. How could the supposedly primitive Soviets have designed and built a tank superior to German engineering? How could the racially inferior Russians be beating the master race at the master race's own game? The answers were uncomfortable for Nazi ideology, but obvious to anyone paying attention. Soviet engineers were skilled and innovative. Soviet industrial capacity, once mobilized, was enormous. And Soviet willingness to accept battlefield losses and keep fighting was something Germany couldn't match. The T-34 became a symbol of Soviet resilience. Even as German forces advanced deep into Soviet territory in 1941, capturing millions of prisoners and destroying thousands of tanks, the T-34s kept appearing. New ones rolled off production lines in factories that had been evacuated east, beyond German reach. Soviet crews became more experienced, learning to use their tanks' advantages effectively. By 1942, Soviet tank tactics had evolved to maximize the T-34's strengths. German soldiers learned to recognize the distinctive silhouette of a T-34 at great distances and to fear it. The low, sloped hull, the large turret, the long barrel of the 76mm gun. When German infantry spotted T-34s approaching, they called desperately for tank support, for anti-tank guns, for airstrikes. Anything to stop the Soviet armor before it rolled over their positions. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 demonstrated the T-34's impact at strategic scale. Germany committed its newest tanks, Panthers and Tigers, to a massive offensive designed to regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. They faced Soviet defenses built around thousands of T-34s. The battle became the largest tank engagement in history, and despite the technical advantages of German Tigers and Panthers, the sheer numbers of T-34s, combined with Soviet tactical improvements, helped blunt the German offensive. By late 1943, even with improved German tanks, the T-34 remained competitive. The Soviets introduced the T-34-85, with a more powerful 85mm gun and improved turret. This version could engage German Panthers on more equal terms and remained in production through the war's end and beyond. What German soldiers said when they first encountered T-34s in June 1941 was a mix of shock, fear, denial, and grudging respect. Their reports to superiors were often dismissed initially, but the truth couldn't be denied for long. The T-34 was real. It was superior to German tanks, and there were thousands of them. The encounter forced Germany into a technological and industrial race it was poorly positioned to win. Soviet factories, operating beyond German bomber range, could outproduce German industry. Soviet design philosophy, emphasizing mass production of reliable, effective weapons, proved more practical than German emphasis on technical perfection. And Soviet willingness to accept casualties and keep fighting meant that even when T-34s were destroyed, more replaced them. Lieutenant Hans Becker died not knowing that his encounter with the T-34 was part of a larger pattern that would help determine the war's outcome. He died believing he'd been unlucky, that he'd faced some unusual Soviet tank that wasn't representative of their overall capability. He never learned that the T-34 was exactly representative of Soviet capability, that it symbolized a nation that could innovate, produce, and fight with a determination Germany hadn't anticipated. The German soldiers who survived the war and wrote memoirs or gave interviews consistently mentioned the T-34 as one of the war's unpleasant surprises. They'd expected Soviet inferiority. They'd found Soviet excellence. They'd expected easy victories. They'd found brutal, grinding battles against an enemy that refused to break. The T-34 didn't win the war alone. Soviet victory came from many factors: industrial capacity, manpower reserves, Allied support, German strategic mistakes, the brutal Russian winter, and the determination of Soviet soldiers and civilians. But the T-34 was emblematic of all these factors. It represented Soviet ability to match German military capability and exceed it in crucial ways. When German soldiers first saw the T-34 and reported that their guns couldn't penetrate it, that it could destroy their tanks with ease, that it was faster and more maneuverable than their panzers, they were reporting the beginning of Germany's defeat on the Eastern Front. They just didn't know it yet. The war would grind on for 4 more years. Millions more would die. Germany would develop new weapons and tactics. But the fundamental imbalance revealed by the T-34 in June 1941 never truly changed. The Soviet Union could produce more, absorb more losses, and keep fighting longer than Germany could. The T-34 was both symbol and instrument of that truth. What German soldiers said when they first encountered T-34 tanks was that they'd met something unexpected, something dangerous, something that challenged everything they'd been told about Soviet inferiority. They said it with words, with frantic radio reports, with desperate calls for support. But mostly, they said it with their actions, the retreats, the flanking attempts, the fear in their voices when they reported T-34s in the area. The T-34 taught German soldiers a lesson their leaders should have learned before invading, that the Soviet Union was not a primitive nation to be easily conquered, but a formidable enemy capable of innovation, production, and sacrifice on a scale Germany couldn't match. By the time that lesson was fully learned, it was far too late. The invasion had become a war of attrition, and attrition was a war Germany could not win. The shock of that first encounter, on June the 24th, 1941, when German shells bounced harmlessly off sloped Soviet armor and German tanks burned under the T-34's guns, echoed across 4 years of brutal combat. It was the moment when German confidence cracked, when the myth of invincibility began to crumble, when soldiers who'd conquered Europe realized they'd finally met their match.